it came to my attention that I could further break down the intro to the empty hand fist sets of the slant body Wing Chun tradition by breaking down the Yiji Kinling Ma stance. And the stance can be broken down into the footwork of the Yiji Kinling Ma stance itself, the stance, the dropping of the weight into the stance, and then the baotron or the chambering of the fists. And so I wanted to make a separate video for each of those. The first one I wanted to do, though, was the dropping of the stance. The dropping of the stance is going to be present in all forms of the stance itself. And so I wanted to emphasize that, as well as touch on a weird little quirk of dropping of the stance. In terms of dropping a stance, or for any martial art, the bending of the knees and the dropping of the center of balance means that you're a more stable platform. Defensively, it means that you're harder to knock over in a striking context, and you're more stable base that they have to rip from you in order to throw you in a grappling context. Offensively, in a striking context, you have a more stable base from which to throw your strikes. But in a grappling context, it means that you can make your opponent carry your weight. By making them carry your weight, that makes it harder for them to throw you. Sometimes this is called sandbagging because you become as unhelpful and committing as much energy as a sandbag. You're just weighing them down. And that can also mean that you can then take that momentum to throw them in a grappling context. The other little quirk is that in the stance drop, you also find a power generation method. Most practitioners of Wing Chun will think of the Chungjin or inch power, the short power. Bruce Lee's 1 inch punch is a classic example of a Wing Chun short power. However, that is not the only form of power generation in Wing Chun, and the stance drop is used. Before we do our training, a lot of times in our warm up, we would put our hands on our hips, turn to face one direction, and then drop the rear knee to drop the stance, like so. And then we'd turn and do it on the other side, like so. Just practicing dropping our knees and dropping our stance downward for power generation purposes. And I think that is something that you do find in other forms of kung fu, just as you do find the inch power in Hung Gar and other forms of Chinese martial arts and even other forms of non-Chinese martial arts. But that stance drop is something that I think you should practice. I would say give that a try. Just try turning and dropping the knee and seeing how your weight drops. Maybe throwing a strike in on a pad, or just practicing throwing strikes with that stance drop and seeing what difference it makes. Another thing that I would suggest you try is a stance dropping with the lead leg, what I learned in longsword as the British high step. I don't know why it's called that. I don't know if it's actually used in British longsword. I just learned it as the British high step of in a longsword tradition, perhaps, to set up a high strike or even a thrust, you lift up the lead leg and then you step forward and use that to propel your attack forward. And keeping in mind that this was in a time before the modern lunge was invented, this was both for power as well as for measure, in that it was a deeper stance that got you a few more inches onto your strike. Maybe not much, definitely not as much as the lunge, which is why the lunge superseded it, but it is something. I'd say give both of those a try. The dropping of the stance, I think, is something that is easy to overlook, especially when you're going through multiple stances. I mean, just going from a natural waiting for the bust style stance into a simple boxing stance drops the weight a little bit. It gives you that solid base. And I think that's something that most people overlook. And they definitely don't look at it as a form of power generation unless they're taught to. So I think that that stance drop is there, and it's it has those applications, but most people don't even think about it. If stance dropping is not your form of power generation, or it's something that, which can happen, it's not something in your lineage of your martial art, sure, don't use it. But I'd say it's something to still look for. And for me, it's something that is applicable both to martial artists, my martial arts friends that fight with unarmed martial arts, as well as my fencing friends. I think anyone who does long sword or even a rapier system or broadsword system might find something, interesting in that raising of the leg and then dropping, even if it goes counterintuitively to their lunge training. I'd say give it a try, see what it does. Until next time, keep your teacups empty. Ganbei. It's good today.